My name is Rebecca. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where competence is supposed to speak louder than personality. I've been a strategist, a coordinator, the person who makes sure the quiet details are handled so other people can shine. If you passed me in the hallway, you probably wouldn't remember my face 5 minutes later. And for a long time, that felt like proof that I was doing my job correctly. People tend to describe me the same way: calm, dependable, easy to work with. Low maintenance, someone once said, as if I were a piece of software that never needed updating. I don't interrupt meetings. I don't fight for airtime. I don't correct people publicly, even when I know they're wrong. That's usually read as softness, sometimes as a lack of ambition, almost never as a restraint. This story isn't about a sudden awakening or a dramatic takedown. It's about something slower and more uncomfortable. It's about the moment I realized that being underestimated isn't always accidental, and that silence, when misunderstood, can become permission. I didn't set out to expose anyone. I didn't plan revenge. In fact, for most of this story, I'm trying very hard to convince myself that nothing is really wrong, that I'm imagining patterns where none exist, that professionalism means absorbing small cuts without flinching. I found out. I was the office punchline, and that sentence still feels strange to say out loud. Not because it was shocking, but because, in hindsight, it made too much sense. The comments, the jokes that landed a second too late, the way my ideas sounded better when someone else repeated them, the casual assumptions about what I would tolerate. The turning point didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came quietly, through text on a screen. A moment of accidental access. A digital room I was never meant to enter. And in that moment, the jokes weren't funny when I read them myself. They weren't cruel in a dramatic way. They were worse than that. Efficient, normalized, and shared with ease. What follows is not a story about destroying people who wronged me. It's about watching a system respond when one invisible piece is carefully removed. It's about what happens when you stop correcting misunderstandings and start letting them play out. There are no heroes here, no villains delivering monologues, just professionals making choices and consequences arriving without announcement. I'm telling this story now because emotional justice doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like documentation. Sometimes it looks like patience. And sometimes it looks like walking away with your integrity intact while others are still trying to figure out what changed. If you've ever felt quietly minimized, trusted with responsibility but denied respect, then you might recognize parts of yourself in this. Not the anger, not the fantasy of revenge, but the slow recalibration that happens when you finally see the room clearly. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever realized that people knew exactly how much they could take from you because you never made them pay attention? In the office, I was known as someone who had things handled. That phrase followed me everywhere. It was said with relief, sometimes even admiration, but never curiosity. People didn't ask how I handled things or what it cost. They just knew that if something was complex, delicate, or quietly urgent, it could be passed to me and disappear from their list of concerns. I didn't arrive early to prove dedication. I arrived early because systems work better when you understand them before the noise starts. I didn't stay late to be noticed. I stayed late because unfinished work has a way of becoming someone else's crisis the next morning. Over time, this behavior shaped a role for me that I never formally agreed to, but slowly inhabited. To them, I was dependable in the same way furniture is dependable. Always there, always useful, rarely acknowledged unless missing. Meetings were a perfect example. I spoke rarely, but when I did, it was usually to clarify details others overlooked. Timelines, dependencies, risks no one wanted to name because they complicated the narrative. When my points were inconvenient, they were met with polite nods and moved past. When they were useful, they were absorbed into the conversation without attribution, resurfacing later in someone else's voice. I told myself this was normal, that influence didn't need credit, that the work mattered more than recognition. And for a long time, that belief protected me. It gave meaning to invisibility. Colleagues described me as easy to collaborate with, easy to assign tasks to, easy to rely on. No one ever asked if being easy came at a cost. No one noticed how often decisions were made around me, even when they directly affected my work, or how feedback was delivered casually to me, but carefully to others. There was a particular tone people used when speaking to me, lighter, less formal. Jokes slipped in that wouldn't have landed the same way with someone else. Not overtly insulting, just familiar. Familiar in a way that assumes tolerance. I smiled through most of it. Not because I enjoyed it, but because challenging it felt disproportionate. Calling out a subtle dismissal often makes you seem like the problem. I didn't want to be seen as sensitive, or difficult, or someone who took things personally. So I absorbed. I adapted. I became even more reliable. What's important to understand is that I wasn't unhappy all the time. I took pride in my competence. I liked being trusted with complexity. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing you're the person people turn to when they don't want mistakes. But trust without respect is a fragile thing. It creates an imbalance that's easy to miss when you're on the giving end. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was in their minds. I wasn't in competition. I wasn't leadership material. I was supported. Infrastructure. The kind of presence that stabilizes others while remaining unchanged itself. No one asked about my ambitions. No one checked whether the role I played was one I wanted to keep. They assumed continuity, that I would always be there, smoothing edges, filling gaps, making them look competent. And maybe that assumption would have held if nothing had tested it. But the truth is, invisibility doesn't happen overnight. It's built through repetition, through moments you let slide because they seem too small to matter, through choosing harmony over accuracy, through believing that being underestimated is safer than being misunderstood. At that stage, I still believed the system was neutral, that any discomfort I felt was incidental. I didn't yet understand that a role unchallenged becomes a boundary, and boundaries unspoken are the easiest to cross. I was not angry. I was not plotting. I was simply present, doing my work, unaware that I had already been defined in a way that would later make everything else inevitable. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. They don't bleed enough to alarm anyone. And when you're used to navigating complexity, you tend to assume discomfort is part of the terrain. We were in a weekly cross-team meeting, the kind designed to create alignment, but often used to boost confidence. I had spent the previous week untangling a dependency issue that no one wanted to claim ownership of. It wasn't glamorous work, just contracts, timelines, and a quiet risk that could have delayed a launch by months if mishandled. When it was my turn to speak, I summarized the issue and offered a clear recommendation. I kept it concise, neutral, professional, no drama. There was a pause, then someone laughed, not at me exactly, but near me. A quick, breathy chuckle like punctuation. "Well," one of the senior managers said, smiling, "leave it to Rebecca to worry about things that haven't happened yet." The room responded the way rooms often do. A few polite smiles. Someone checked their laptop. The conversation moved on. No one corrected him. No one asked a follow-up question. And I didn't push back. On the surface, it was nothing. A comment that could be interpreted as reassurance. Maybe even a compliment. She's thorough, she thinks ahead. That's what I told myself. That's what professionalism often demands. Reinterpretation. But something about the tone lingered. Not dismissive enough to challenge, just enough to reframe my contribution as overcautious, excessive, optional. After the meeting, I replayed it in my head while walking back to my desk. I asked myself whether I was being sensitive, whether I should have clarified my point more forcefully, or whether doing so would have made me seem defensive. I chose silence. That choice mattered more than I understood at the time. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. A joke about how I always had a spreadsheet for everything. A comment about me being the responsible one was said in a way that suggested dullness rather than reliability. Each instance was small, plausibly harmless, easily dismissed. And each time, the same internal negotiation played out. Is this worth addressing? Would correcting this help or hurt? Is it even intentional? What made it harder was that no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't signal it. The absence of reaction from others made the moments feel subjective, almost imaginary. Like I was reading subtext that didn't exist. That's how normalization begins, not with overt disrespect, but with isolation. When your experience isn't mirrored, you start editing it yourself. I told myself that people were under pressure, that humor was a coping mechanism, that not every comment deserved analysis. I reminded myself that I had influence where it mattered, in outcomes, not optics. Still, something shifted. I became more careful about when I spoke, more selective. Not because I had less to contribute, but because I didn't want my words reframed as caution or obstruction. I adjusted my tone, my phrasing, even my posture in meetings. Small calibrations designed to reduce friction. No one asked me to do this. I did it instinctively, the way you adjust your pace when walking beside someone faster than you. What I didn't realize then was that these adjustments were being interpreted, not as professionalism, but as acquiescence. The original comment was never revisited. No apology was offered, because none was requested. The risk I flagged eventually surfaced months later, quietly, as an unexpected complication. By then, it was too late to connect it back to that meeting. And when the issue was discussed, my name wasn't mentioned. That should have bothered me more than it did. But at the time, I felt something closer to resignation. A sense that this was simply how things worked. That my role was to anticipate, absorb, and adapt. I still believed that consistency would protect me. If I remained competent and calm, respect would follow naturally. I didn't yet see that the first small cut had already done its work, not by hurting me, but by teaching others how much they could say without consequence. Once something goes unchallenged, it doesn't stay singular. It becomes a reference point. What started as an offhand comment slowly turned into a pattern, not loud enough to disrupt meetings, but consistent enough to shape perception. I was no longer just thorough. I was overly thorough. Not just reliable, but predictable. The kind of person whose contributions were expected to orbit logistics, never vision. I noticed it in the way conversations flowed. When strategic questions were raised, eyes turned toward the louder voices in the room. When operational problems surfaced, someone would glance at me, already halfway through the sentence that would assign it to me. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. And efficiency has a way of justifying almost anything. At first, I resisted the label internally. I told myself that being dependable wasn't a weakness, that someone had to hold the structure together. But the more I accepted the assignments without comment, the more complete the picture became. For them, I became the person you could tease lightly, because I wouldn't react. The person you could interrupt, because I would wait. The person whose silence could be filled in by others, often inaccurately, without correction. There was a meeting where someone presented a framework I had developed months earlier. The language was nearly identical, the structure unmistakable. As he spoke, I watched the room respond, nodding, engaged, impressed. When he finished, someone said, "This is really sharp thinking." I felt something then. Not anger, not even resentment. Just a quiet recognition. I could have spoken up. I could have said that the framework originated in my earlier proposal. But I didn't. Because I knew how that would sound. Defensive. Petty. Like I was keeping score. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, the room learned something else about me. That I would not claim what was mine if doing so disrupted the flow. From that point on, the jokes became easier, more frequent, still subtle. A comment about how I lived in the details. A remark about me being the safety net. These weren't insults in the traditional sense. They were classifications. And classifications, once accepted, are hard to escape. I began to notice how often my workload increased without corresponding authority. How decisions were finalized without my input, then handed to me for execution. How feedback was framed as expectation, not discussion. I normalized it the way many people do, by reframing it as trust. They rely on me. They know I'll handle it. This is job security. But deep down, something felt misaligned. Trust usually comes with respect, with inclusion, with acknowledgement. What I was experiencing felt more like delegation without dignity. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of it was self-preservation. Challenging a culture requires energy, and I wasn't sure I wanted to spend mine fighting perceptions that others didn't even recognize as problematic. Another part was fear, not of retaliation, but of exposure. If I named the pattern, I would have to admit how long I'd allowed it. So I adjusted again. I made my work even more precise. My communication is even clearer. I anticipated questions before they were asked. I removed obstacles before they became visible. I became, in every sense, indispensable. And yet, the more indispensable I became, the less visible I was treated. That's the paradox of normalized disrespect. It doesn't feel like hostility. It feels like familiarity without care. Like being known only for what you provide, not who you are. No one ever sat me down and told me my role. It was communicated through repetition, through what was rewarded and what was ignored, through laughter that carried just enough truth to shape reality. By the time I realized what was happening, the pattern had already solidified. My silence had become part of the system, a stabilizing force that allowed others to expand comfortably, knowing someone else would absorb the weight. I wasn't being pushed down. I was being leaned on. And the hardest part was this. I had helped build the version of me they now relied on. Not out of weakness, but out of a belief that professionalism meant endurance. I still hadn't decided to change anything. I wasn't planning a shift, but something inside me had begun to take notes. Not emotionally, but structurally. I was observing the mechanics of how respect erodes when boundaries remain unspoken. I didn't yet know what I would do with that awareness, but I had stopped dismissing it. It's unsettling to realize that people have already decided who you are, without ever asking. By the time I became aware of the role I occupied, it was no longer subtle. It had shape, edges, expectations. I could feel it in the way requests were phrased, in the assumptions baked into conversations before I ever entered the room. I was the one who would take care of it, the one who didn't need context because I would find it, the one who didn't need recognition because I was above that. These weren't compliments. They were permissions granted by others, accepted by me. What struck me most was how consistent the role was across different people. New hires learned it quickly. They watched how others interacted with me and followed suit. If someone needed help, they came to me quietly. If someone needed credit, they went elsewhere. No one questioned this arrangement, not because it was fair, but because it worked. I began to see how often my name was used in absentia. Rebecca will handle it. Rebecca already knows. Rebecca's good with details. Statements delivered with certainty, without confirmation. I wasn't asked. I was assigned, socially, informally, invisibly. And still I complied. Part of me believed that this role was temporary, that eventually, someone would notice the imbalance, that performance would naturally lead to advancement, or at least recalibration. I told myself to be patient, to let the work speak. But work doesn't speak, people do. And the people speaking on my behalf had already decided what story they were telling. I noticed how my suggestions were filtered through others, how ideas I raised were framed as logistical support rather than strategic insight, how leadership conversations happened around me, not with me. When I was included, it was to validate decisions already made, not to shape them. The most revealing moments came when something went wrong. Then suddenly, my role expanded. I was pulled into urgent discussions, asked to fix, mitigate, stabilize. And when things returned to normal, I was gently set back into place. Reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't angry at any one person. That would have been easier. Anger gives you a target. What I felt instead was a growing clarity about systems, how roles calcify when they go unexamined, how silence becomes consent, how being easy to work with can quietly disqualify you from being taken seriously. I started paying attention to language. Those who were described as driving initiatives versus those who were supporting them, to those who were praised for leadership and those who were thanked for effort. These distinctions weren't accidental. They were rehearsed, reinforced, and rarely challenged. And then there was the humor. It wasn't mean-spirited. That's what made it effective. Jokes about me being the adult in the room. About me keeping everyone out of trouble. Laughter followed by quick glances in my direction, checking whether I would smile. I always did. What they didn't see was that I had begun to understand the function of those jokes. They weren't about bonding. They were about positioning. Humor softened the boundary lines while making them unmistakably clear. I was not the protagonist of any story. I was the infrastructure. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I lacked the words, but because I was beginning to understand leverage. Emotional reactions dissipate quickly. Structural awareness does not. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I had stopped participating unconsciously. I started asking myself a different question. Not why are they doing this, but what does this role allow them to avoid? The answer was uncomfortable. As long as I remained in my assigned place, others didn't have to examine their own behavior. They didn't have to slow down. They didn't have to share space. They didn't have to listen more carefully. My reliability had become their convenience. And convenience, once established, is rarely relinquished voluntarily. That was the moment I understood that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't be because someone suddenly realized they'd been unfair. It would be because the system stopped working the way it always had. I just didn't know yet how or when that would happen. The shift didn't arrive with conflict. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment anyone else in the room would remember. That's why it stayed with me. It belonged entirely to me. It happened on a quiet afternoon when the office was thinning out. The kind of day where focus settles in because there's nothing left to perform. I was reviewing documentation, routine, almost meditative, when a notification appeared on my screen. A shared folder. One I wasn't meant to see. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. A permissions error. Those happen all the time. I clicked in with the same casual curiosity you bring to anything unexpected but likely unimportant. The folder contained screenshots, chat transcripts, snippets of internal messages saved without context, like notes someone intended to organize later. My name appeared more than once. I didn't feel panic or anger. I felt a kind of stillness, the way your body reacts before your emotions catch up. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that this was probably harmless, that reading further would only create discomfort where none was intended. I kept reading. The tone was light, playful, familiar, the kind of humor that assumes shared understanding. There were jokes about my meticulousness, about how I never said no, about how I was the safest person to dump complicated work on because I wouldn't push back. One message stood out more than the others. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. She won't mind. She never does. That sentence landed differently. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it was true. And because it wasn't said to me. It was said about me as a certainty. I realized then that I wasn't misreading the situation. The role I sensed wasn't a projection. It was an agreement, made without me, upheld through repetition, and reinforced by my silence. I closed the folder without saving anything. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't forward it to myself. I didn't need proof. The clarity was enough. For the rest of the afternoon, I continued working as usual. Answered emails, completed tasks, responded politely to questions. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something had settled. The shift wasn't emotional. It was cognitive. A recalibration of assumptions. I stopped asking whether people meant to be dismissive. Intention became irrelevant. What mattered was impact and the predictability of it. On my way home that evening, I didn't replay the messages in my head. I replayed my own behavior. The times I'd stayed late without being asked. The times I'd absorbed blame quietly to protect a timeline. The times I'd smiled through jokes that reduced me to a function. Not with regret, with understanding. I saw how I had contributed to the version of me they found so convenient. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed competence would eventually translate into respect. That belief dissolved quietly. I didn't feel betrayed. Betrayal implies a broken promise. No one had promised me anything. They had simply taken what was available. And I had made myself available in every way that mattered. That night, I wrote in my notebook, not about them, about me. I listed the things I controlled: my time, my documentation, my decisions, my silence. And then I asked myself a question that changed everything. What would happen if I stopped cushioning the system? I didn't answer it right away. I didn't need to. The question itself was enough to alter my posture, to shift how I entered rooms, to change what I volunteered. The next day, I went to work as usual. I spoke when necessary. I smiled when appropriate. But something was different. Not in my behavior, but in my intention. Silence was no longer the default. It was deliberate. And for the first time, I understood that restraint, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It's positioning. No one noticed the shift yet. There was nothing to notice. But inside me, a line had been drawn. Not in anger, but in clarity. From that point on, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was watching. After that day, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't set boundaries out loud or redefine expectations in a meeting. That would have invited negotiation, and I wasn't interested in debate. What I wanted was observation. Clean, uninterrupted. So I let silence do what it does best when used intentionally: reveal structure. I stopped preempting problems, not by withholding effort, but by withholding anticipation. If something wasn't explicitly assigned to me, I didn't absorb it automatically. If a risk wasn't acknowledged by the group, I didn't rush to soften it in advance. I let timelines breathe. I let questions remain unanswered until they were asked directly. To anyone watching casually, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still responsive, still professional. But the system began to feel the absence of something it had relied on without naming. People mistook this silence for fatigue or disengagement. One colleague asked if I was doing okay, in that vague way that assumes emotional fragility rather than strategic restraint. I thanked him and said I was fine, which was true. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, I was precise. I no longer fill gaps. I no longer translate vague ideas into executable plans unless asked. When someone said, "We'll figure it out later," I let that stand, even when I knew exactly how complicated later would be. The jokes continued briefly. A comment about me being quiet, about me letting go a little. I smiled, not because it amused me, but because I didn't need to correct their interpretation. Let them believe what they wanted. What fascinated me was how quickly others stepped into the vacuum. Not with competence, but with confidence. Tasks were claimed hastily. Decisions were made without a full understanding. The safety net they'd leaned on for years was no longer cushioning their movements. And they didn't yet realize why things felt less stable. I watched without judgment. This wasn't punishment. It was information. I paid attention to how often my name still came up. How many assumptions persisted even as my behavior shifted. Rebecca probably has a doc on that. She'll catch it if it's wrong. Each time I noted whether anyone checked with me first. Most didn't. That told me everything. My silence forced clarity. It showed me which relationships were built on respect and which were built on convenience. A few colleagues adjusted quickly. They asked more direct questions. They looped me in earlier. With them, I responded fully. Not because I owed them, but because the exchange was mutual. Others grew frustrated, subtly at first, then more openly. Deadlines slipped. Miscommunications surfaced. The system they thought was self-sustaining revealed its dependencies. Still, no one connected it to me, and that was the point. When silence is chosen, it becomes a mirror. It reflects the assumptions others make when they think you're not paying attention. It reveals how much of your labor was invisible precisely because it was consistent. I documented everything, not as evidence against anyone, but as a record of reality. Requests, decisions, omissions. I stopped correcting misunderstandings unless they directly implicated me. I let responsibility sit where it was placed. What surprised me most was how little discomfort I felt. I had expected guilt, anxiety, the urge to step in and smooth things over. Instead, I felt calm, grounded, like I had finally aligned my actions with my values. I wasn't being passive. I was being selective. The office continued as it always had, just slightly off balance. People are compensated with more meetings, more emails, and more noise. None of it addressed the root issue, that they had mistaken my silence for endless availability. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to confront anyone. The system was already responding to the change, even if it didn't understand it yet. This phase taught me something essential. Silence, when used unconsciously, invites exploitation. Silence, when used deliberately, creates leverage. I was no longer invisible to myself. And that changed the way I occupied every space, even when no one else noticed yet. They would, just not all at once. What they never noticed wasn't my silence. It was what I was doing with it. While the surface of my work appeared unchanged, my attention had shifted elsewhere. I was no longer focused on keeping things smooth. I was studying how things actually worked, who depended on whom, where decisions originated, and how accountability dissolved as it moved down the chain. I had always been observant. That was part of my nature. But now, observation had intent. I began mapping workflows the way an architect studies stress points. Not just the official processes, but the informal ones, the back channels, the assumptions, the shortcuts everyone relied on but never documented. I noted where authority was claimed without responsibility, and where responsibility was carried without authority. None of this required secrecy. It required patience. I reviewed old project files, not for nostalgia, but for patterns. I saw how often my name appeared in execution phases and disappeared in strategic summaries. How decisions attributed to the team often originated from a single voice, while the labor was distributed unevenly. I also noticed how little redundancy existed. How much institutional memory lived in my head, my notes, my quiet habits. Not because I had hoarded it, but because no one had ever bothered to ask how things actually worked. They trusted that I would be there. That trust was unexamined, and therefore fragile. I refined my documentation, not to make it more accessible, but to make it precise. Clear ownership, clear timelines, clear decision trails. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. When something was unclear, I wrote it down as unclear. When responsibility was ambiguous, I noted that too. I wasn't building a case, I was building a record. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I updated certifications I'd postponed because I was too busy. I had conversations outside my department, listening more than speaking, learning how others perceived the organization, where friction existed beyond my immediate sphere. What struck me was how often people assumed I knew things, and how rarely they asked for my perspective. That asymmetry became useful. I learned which conversations happened without me, and which stalled until I was involved. I learned how decisions were framed upward and how outcomes were explained downward. I learned who spoke with confidence and who spoke with care, and how those traits were rewarded differently. No one noticed this shift because it didn't disrupt anything. It didn't challenge egos. It didn't demand space. It simply accumulated understanding. There's a misconception that preparation looks like action. Often, it looks like restraint. I resisted the urge to correct missteps that weren't mine to correct. I let others experience the consequences of incomplete thinking, not catastrophically, but enough to register discomfort, enough to create questions. Still, I remained professional, helpful when asked, clear when consulted. I wasn't withholding competence. I was withholding compensation for others' assumptions. What they didn't notice was that I had stopped being reactive. I was no longer responding to the environment. I was reading it. I noticed who grew anxious when things weren't immediately resolved, who escalated prematurely, who blamed ambiguity on execution rather than planning. These behaviors told me more than any performance review ever had, and through it all, the jokes faded. Not because respect had increased, but because uncertainty had. Humor thrives on predictability. When people no longer knew how I would respond, or whether I would absorb the impact, they became more cautious. Still, no one asked me what had changed. That silence confirmed what I needed to know. My value had never been fully understood, only relied upon. By the end of that period, I had something far more useful than leverage in the traditional sense. I had clarity. About systems, about people, about myself. I knew exactly where I stood, and exactly what would happen if I moved. I wasn't rushing toward a reveal. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was positioning myself so that whatever choice I made next would be irreversible. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because the most effective shifts don't announce themselves. They simply change the outcome. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no satisfaction, no spike of triumph. Just a quiet moment of alignment, like two lines finally meeting after running parallel for too long. It happened late one evening, long after the office had emptied. I wasn't staying late out of obligation anymore. I stayed because I wanted uninterrupted time, to review, to think, to confirm what I already suspected. I was cross-referencing project archives with recent decisions, old timelines against new explanations. What emerged wasn't a scandal or misconduct in the dramatic sense. It was something far more ordinary and far more powerful. Dependency. Entire workflows depended on processes that only existed because I maintained them. Not formally, not officially, but functionally. I had become the connective tissue between departments that didn't speak to each other well. I translated priorities, reconciled contradictions, and quietly prevented escalation by absorbing complexity before it reached leadership. None of this was documented as my responsibility, which meant none of it was protected. If I left, or even stepped back fully, there was no immediate replacement. No clear handoff. No institutional memory is preserved at the level required to keep things moving smoothly. This wasn't arrogance, it was math. I tested the theory gently. I delayed a response by a day, then 2. Not critical items, just things that had always landed with me by default. The ripple effects appeared quickly. Meetings were rescheduled. Questions were asked multiple times by different people. Confusion surfaced where there had once been flow. Still, no one reached out directly to ask why. They were busy compensating. That's when it became clear. My leverage wasn't in information I could expose. It was in stability that I could withdraw. And withdrawal didn't require confrontation. I sat with that understanding for a long time. Not because I was unsure, but because I was careful. Power discovered too quickly can tempt impulsive action. I didn't want to use it. I wanted to decide what it meant. I asked myself hard questions, not about them, but about me. Did I want acknowledgement, repositioning, departure? Was my goal correction or closure? The answer surprised me. I didn't want to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need validation from people who had only ever seen me as infrastructure. What I wanted was alignment between how I worked and how I was treated. That alignment wasn't available where I was. The realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I reviewed my options with the same calm I brought to everything else. Internal transfer, role renegotiation, external opportunities. Each had implications. Each required timing. I chose the path that required the least explanation. I began preparing quietly, updating records so nothing essential would be lost, but also so nothing would be magically maintained without effort. I ensured my documentation was accurate, but not interpretive. Clear, but not cushioning. I wasn't setting traps. I was removing scaffolding. The private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing. It was about discovering choice. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my environment. I was shaping my exit from it. What struck me most was how calm I felt. No bitterness, no urgency, just a steady certainty that I had reached the end of an agreement I had never consciously signed. I didn't owe anyone drama. I didn't owe anyone a lesson. I owed myself coherence, so I moved forward deliberately, quietly, without signaling what was coming. Because when leverage is structural, not emotional, it doesn't need to be announced. It simply changes what happens next. Every story like this has a moment people expect to be dramatic. A confrontation, a declaration, a line drawn publicly. This wasn't that moment. The decision point arrived quietly, on a morning that looked like any other. I was sitting at my desk, coffee cooling beside me, reviewing a calendar invite that had been forwarded, not sent, to me. A meeting about a process I had designed was scheduled without my involvement. That was when I knew, not emotionally, logically. I saw, with complete clarity, that nothing inside the system would correct itself. There would be no sudden insight, no collective reflection. The role I occupied wasn't misunderstood. It was useful. And usefulness, when convenient, is rarely questioned. I had 3 options. The first was to speak up, to request a role clarification, a title adjustment, or formal recognition of responsibilities. On paper, it was reasonable. In reality, it would require me to educate people who had benefited from not understanding. It would invite discussion without guaranteeing change. And even if it succeeded, it would tether my future to the same system that had already shown me how it functioned. The second option was to stay and adapt further, to accept the role fully and stop expecting more from it, to do excellent work, collect a paycheck, and emotionally disengage. Many people choose this path. It's not a weakness. It's survival. But for me, that would have required shrinking something essential. Not my ambition, my integrity. The third option was irreversible, to leave. Not abruptly, not noisily, but cleanly. To remove myself from the structure that depended on my silence. To let the system experience the reality it had avoided by leaning on me. This option didn't come with vindication. It came with uncertainty, with risk, with the knowledge that once I stepped away, there would be no controlling the narrative. And that was exactly why it was the right one. I wasn't leaving to make a point. I was leaving because staying would require continued self-erasure. Because no amount of quiet excellence would recalibrate a role that had already solidified. I didn't decide out of anger. I decided out of respect for myself. Once the decision was made, everything else became simple. Not easy. Simple. I set a timeline. Not rushed, but firm. I reviewed my obligations carefully. I identified what I would transition and what I would not compensate for beyond my role. I prepared for departure the way I prepared for everything else, with precision. What I didn't do was signal my intent. There's a misconception that integrity requires transparency at all stages. In reality, integrity requires honesty at the right stage. Premature disclosure would have triggered scrambling, performative concern, and last-minute promises. None of that would have changed the underlying structure. So I waited. I continued working, continued attending meetings, continued responding calmly. The same demeanor that had once been mistaken for compliance now protected my autonomy. No one suspected anything because nothing in my behavior suggested dissatisfaction. That, more than anything, confirmed my choice. They had never been paying attention to my internal state, only to my output. I imagined, briefly, what it would feel like to explain myself, to articulate the accumulation of moments, the jokes, the assumptions. But explanation implies a desire to be understood. I no longer needed that. The decision point wasn't about them realizing my value. It was about me deciding where it belonged. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. Not because I wouldn't be welcomed, but because I would never again fit comfortably into a space that required me to disappear in order to function. I closed my notebook that morning with a sense of finality. Not loss, not triumph, resolution. The next phase wouldn't involve speeches or revelations. It would involve movement. Quiet, deliberate, and already underway. Once the decision was made, I moved the way I always had, without drawing attention. That's the advantage of being underestimated for so long. No one watches closely when they believe they already understand you. I didn't announce my intentions or change my tone. I didn't suddenly become distant or overly helpful. I kept my pace steady, my presence consistent. On the surface, I was still the same Rebecca. Calm, reliable, quietly competent. Underneath, everything was in motion. I began by formalizing what had never been formal. I documented processes the way they actually existed, not the way people assumed they did. I stopped bridging gaps between departments, unless it was explicitly part of my role. When someone said, "Can you just take a look at this real quick?" I asked clarifying questions, not defensively, just factually. Is this something you'd like feedback on? Or are you assigning ownership? That single sentence changed more than any confrontation could have. Some people hesitated. Others backtracked. A few clarified. Each response gave me more information about how responsibility had been casually displaced for years. I scheduled my remaining time carefully. Knowledge transfer, where appropriate. Clear handoffs, where necessary. But I did not redesign the system to survive without me. I simply stopped compensating for its blind spots. There's a difference. I also took steps outside the office. Conversations that had been postponed. Applications submitted quietly. Interviews conducted without urgency. I wasn't running from something. I was moving toward alignment. What struck me during this phase was how invisible preparation can be when it doesn't announce itself. People often think power moves require spectacle. In reality, the most consequential ones look like nothing at all until they're complete. No one noticed the subtle shifts at first. The delayed responses. The questions that bounced back unanswered. The meetings that ended without clear next steps. These weren't failures. They were reflections. Still, no one connected them to me. When minor issues escalated, they were framed as temporary hiccups. Growing pains. Miscommunication. Leadership scheduled more check-ins, more syncs, more space to align. All of it is noise, circling the problem without naming it. I watched calmly. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. What surprised me most was how often people spoke about responsibility. How rarely anyone asked, "Who actually owns this?" That question had been quietly answered for years, by my availability. Now that availability had limits, I submitted my notice without explanation beyond the professional minimum. No manifesto, no list of grievances, just gratitude for the experience and clarity about my final date. The reaction was immediate, but muted. Surprise, certainly. Concern, expressed politely. A few attempts to understand my reasons, phrased carefully enough to avoid discomfort. I answered honestly, but incompletely. I'm ready for a different kind of challenge. That was true, and it was enough. What I didn't do was reassure them. I didn't promise extended availability or transitional heroics. I committed to my responsibilities, and only those. The days that followed were strange. People became more attentive, but not reflective. More polite, but not curious. The jokes disappeared entirely, replaced by a cautious professionalism that felt unfamiliar. Too late. As my departure approached, the system began to strain in visible ways. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. Questions looped. Decisions stalled. People searched for clarity that no longer arrived automatically. Still, no one said my name in those conversations. And that was the final confirmation. I wasn't leaving a team. I was leaving a dependency they had never acknowledged. Moving in silence had done what confrontation never could. It revealed the truth without accusation. It allowed consequences to surface naturally, without me having to orchestrate them. I didn't feel powerful. I felt free, because the moment you stop performing stability for others, you reclaim it for yourself. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way structural weaknesses always do, quietly at first, then all around. In the beginning, people tried to compensate with urgency. Meetings multiplied. Emails grew longer. Calendars filled with placeholders labeled alignment and sync. There was movement everywhere, but very little direction. I watched this from a careful distance, not detached, but no longer responsible for absorbing the weight of it. Requests came in more frequently during my final weeks. Not overt demands, clarifications, confirmations. Subtle fishing for the kind of reassurance I used to provide without being asked. Just want to sanity check this. Can you confirm we're not missing anything? You've seen this kind of issue before, right? I answered when it was appropriate. Briefly, accurately, without extrapolation. What they were really asking was something else. Will you catch us if we fall? And for the first time, the answer was no. Deadlines began to slip. Not dramatically, but enough to cause discomfort. A handoff failed because no one had clearly owned it. A decision was stalled because two teams assumed the other was handling the details. These weren't new problems. They were newly visible. I noticed how quickly people searched for explanations that didn't involve reflection. Tools were blamed. Communication styles. External pressures. Anything but the absence of the quiet stabilizer they'd relied on without naming. There was a meeting near the end of my notice period where confusion finally surfaced openly. Voices stayed polite, but tension was unmistakable. Someone asked, "Has it always been this complicated?" I didn't answer, because it had always been this complicated. It just hadn't always been felt. The consequences weren't punitive. They were proportional. The system was experiencing the cost of assumptions it had made over time, that someone else would always smooth the edges. That silence meant consent. That reliability was infinite. A few colleagues reached out privately, not to apologize, but to understand. Their questions were genuine, if belated. How did you manage all of this? Was there a framework you used? I didn't realize how much was routed through you. I responded honestly, without embellishment. I shared what I could, where it made sense. But I didn't compress years of experience into a final gesture of rescue. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. What struck me was how disoriented some people felt. Not because things were failing, but because there was no clear person to absorb uncertainty. They had confused stability with presence. When the presence was removed, they realized stability had never been guaranteed. Leadership grew more attentive in my final days. Questions sharpened. Conversations became more careful. There was an unspoken recognition that something essential had been overlooked, but no one quite knew how to name it without implicating themselves. I wasn't invited into those reflections, and I didn't expect to be. The consequences were already doing their work. On my last day, there were polite farewells, well wishes, promises to stay in touch. The tone was respectful, but distant, like people speaking to someone they hadn't fully known. As I packed my things, I felt no triumph, no sadness, just a quiet certainty that the chapter was complete. The system would continue. It always does. But it would do so with new friction, new awareness, new costs. Whether those costs would lead to change wasn't my concern. The consequences had begun, not because I intended harm, but because I stopped preventing discomfort that wasn't mine to carry. And sometimes that's all it takes. The realization did not arrive for them as insight. It arrived as an urgency. By the time the questions became more pointed, the tone more strained, the window for easy repair had already closed. What they were experiencing wasn't a crisis. It was exposure. The exposure of a system that had relied too heavily on one quiet constant without ever formalizing it. I heard about the scramble secondhand. Meetings held without conclusions. Documents were revised repeatedly because no one was sure what the original intent had been. Decisions were delayed, not because of disagreement, but because of uncertainty about who had the authority to finalize them. The phrase that surfaced more than once was, "We didn't realize how much she was handling." That sentence carried weight. Not because it acknowledged my contribution, but because it admitted something else. That realization had come too late. People reached out again, this time with a different energy. Not curiosity. Concern. "Is there any chance you'd consider staying on a bit longer? Could we consult you after you leave? Just to bridge the gap? What would it take to make this transition smoother?" These weren't unreasonable requests. They were also revealing. The system didn't want to change. It wanted continuity. My presence had been a solution to problems it didn't want to examine. Losing that presence felt like a loss, but not the kind that inspires transformation. The kind that seeks replacement. I listened. I responded politely. I declined. Not because I wanted them to struggle, but because stepping back in would have reinforced the very pattern I was leaving. It would have signaled that my boundaries were flexible when pressure increased, that my decision was negotiable. It wasn't. What made this stage difficult wasn't guilt. It was a restraint. The temptation to help, to smooth, to guide, to rescue was deeply ingrained. But I understood now that rescue would only delay the necessary reckoning. The truth was, nothing could be fixed quickly because nothing had been built intentionally. Roles were being discussed retroactively. Responsibilities redefined in the absence of the person who had quietly fulfilled them. That kind of reorganization is always messier than proactive design. Leadership attempted to intervene, but without a clear understanding of what had actually been happening. Their efforts felt abstract. New processes were proposed without addressing old assumptions. Titles were adjusted without changing dynamics. It was patchwork, and patchwork, done under pressure, rarely holds. I noticed something else too, something more human. There was regret. Not expressed directly to me, but visible in behavior. In the careful way people spoke my name now. In the references to how things used to work. In the nostalgia for a stability they hadn't known how to value. But regret doesn't reverse time. And it doesn't automatically produce accountability. By the time anyone asked the most important question, why did this happen? I was already gone. Too late to fix it didn't mean the organization would collapse. It meant the easy version of stability was no longer available. The version that depended on one person absorbing complexity without recognition. They would adapt. Or they wouldn't. Either way, it would be visible. From my distance, what I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was closure. A clean separation between what I had been responsible for and what I never should have been. I hadn't left to teach a lesson. But lessons often arrive anyway, uninvited, when patterns break. And once broken, they can't be unbroken by goodwill alone. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no emotional appeals. It happened weeks after I had left, in a quiet meeting room I no longer belonged to. They asked if I would come in for a conversation. Not an exit interview. That window had passed. But a check-in. I agreed, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see how clarity sounded on the other side of distance. The room felt smaller than I remembered. Familiar, but no longer mine. There were 3 of them, all professional, all careful. They thanked me for coming, for my time, for my contributions. The words were polished, practiced. They had been rehearsing this. One of them finally said what the meeting was actually about. "We didn't realize how much pressure you were under." I nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. Another added, "There were assumptions made about what you were comfortable handling." Still, I didn't interrupt. They waited, perhaps expecting emotion, anger, validation, something they could respond to. When none came, one of them asked gently, "Why didn't you say something?" The question was sincere and incomplete. I answered calmly, "I did, just not directly. I adjusted, I absorbed. I stayed quiet because I thought the work would speak for itself." They exchanged glances, no defensiveness, just discomfort. I continued, not to accuse, but to clarify. I didn't leave because of one comment or one person. I left because the role I was in had no path forward that didn't require me to disappear more. There was a pause, the kind that suggests recognition, not resolution. They asked if anything could have changed the outcome. If a different conversation, earlier, might have led to a different decision. I thought about that honestly. Possibly, I said. But it would have required curiosity before urgency. That landed. This wasn't about blame. I made that clear. I didn't list grievances or recount jokes. I didn't need to. They already knew the pattern now, because they were living without its buffer. What struck me was how restrained the conversation was. No one tried to defend past behavior. No one minimized my experience, but no one fully claimed responsibility either. The language stayed collective, passive, safe. I understood then that this meeting wasn't about reconciliation. It was about containment, about understanding just enough to prevent recurrence, without reopening uncomfortable truths. And that was fine. They asked if I would consider consulting. Short term, limited scope, clearly defined. I declined, again calmly. I'm not interested in revisiting the same dynamics in a different format. They accepted that more easily than I expected. As the meeting ended, one of them said something quietly, almost to themselves. We should have paid closer attention. I met their eyes and replied, attention usually follows discomfort. There was no argument, no resolution to document, just a shared understanding that something had passed. When I left the building, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had been heard, but because I no longer needed to be. The confrontation had no heat because heat wasn't necessary. Clarity doesn't require volume. It requires distance. And distance, I had learned, changes everything. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. It's a result of what I finally understood. For a long time, I believed that being steady meant being still. That professionalism meant endurance. That if I stayed calm long enough, respectful enough, useful enough, the environment around me would eventually adjust. It didn't. What changed wasn't my temperament. I'm still quiet, still observant, still drawn to complexity and nuance. But I no longer confuse restraint with obligation. I work differently now. Not louder, not harder, more deliberately. I choose environments that name responsibility clearly, where silence isn't mistaken for consent, and reliability isn't treated as a renewable resource, where respect is demonstrated structurally, not just verbally. And when those conditions aren't present, I notice early. The most important shift has been internal. I no longer negotiate with myself about whether something is worth addressing. I don't minimize patterns just because each instance appears small. I understand now that erosion happens incrementally, and that early clarity is kinder than late departure. I still don't seek conflict. I don't need to. Boundaries, when set calmly and early, prevent most of it. People sometimes ask me how I changed. What book did I read? What confidence I found? They expect a moment of empowerment, a turning point that feels cinematic. There wasn't one. There was just a decision to stop cushioning systems that benefited from my silence. I don't feel hardened by the experience. If anything, I feel more precise, more aligned, less willing to perform stability at the expense of self-respect. I still believe in quiet strength, but I understand now that quiet doesn't mean unseen, and if it does, that's information, not a virtue. What I carry forward isn't resentment, it's discernment. I pay attention to how people listen when nothing is at stake, how they respond to hesitation, how they distribute credit when it's inconvenient. These things tell you more than titles ever will. I also recognize my own patterns more clearly. The urge to step in, to smooth, to anticipate. Those instincts don't disappear. But now I ask whether they're invited or simply expected. If they're expected, I pause. That pause has become my power. I don't measure my value by how indispensable I am anymore. Indispensability is often just invisibility dressed up as praise. I measure it by how replaceable my role is without collapse, and how respected my presence is while I'm there. I didn't lose anything by leaving that environment. I gained coherence. Who I am now is someone who understands that dignity isn't granted after endurance. It's established through alignment between what you give and how it's received. And I no longer stay where that alignment is missing. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a lesson wrapped in certainty. A clear villain. A clear victory. Something you can point to and say, this is what justice looks like. But real emotional justice is quieter than that. It doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with alignment. Looking back, the most important thing I learned wasn't about offices or systems or even disrespect. It was about how easily we confuse endurance with integrity. How often do we believe that if we just absorb a little more, explain a little less, stay a little quieter, things will even out on their own? They usually don't. Not because people are cruel, but because systems follow incentives, not intentions. And silence, when it's consistent, becomes an incentive. It teaches others what they can rely on without asking, what they can take without consequence. For a long time, I thought my calm was protecting me. I see now that it was protecting everyone else from discomfort, at my expense. The shift didn't happen when I demanded respect. It happened when I stopped subsidizing disrespect with my competence. When I removed myself from a role that required me to disappear in order to function. That wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was proportion. No one was humiliated. No bridges were burned. The system simply had to experience itself without the quiet buffer it had grown accustomed to. And in that experience, clarity emerged. Too late to reverse the outcome, but early enough to matter going forward. For me, justice didn't look like being proven right. It looked like not needing to be proven anything at all. It looked like choosing environments where contribution and recognition move at the same pace, where silence is read as thoughtfulness, not availability, where humor doesn't rely on diminishing someone else's role. And perhaps most importantly, it looked like forgiving myself for how long I stayed. Because staying quiet doesn't mean you didn't know. Often, it means you were hoping things would change without forcing you to change first. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in parts of it, not the situation, but the posture, I want to be clear about something. You're not weak for enduring. You're not naive for believing in professionalism. And you're not wrong for wanting harmony. But harmony that depends on your erasure is not harmony. It's convenient. And convenience, once challenged, reveals everything. So I'll leave you with one question. Not rhetorical, not dramatic, just honest. Have you ever realized that the reason people don't notice your absence yet is because you're still cushioning the impact of being there? If that question lingers, I'd like to hear your thoughts.